think we are waiting for a few more people to join, so you might give them just a couple more minutes. But in the meantime, I'll just do a little bit of housekeeping for you. So firstly, welcome to today's workshop. It's the first workshop we're doing for the Heritage Arts Challenge. Hopefully some of you were able to make it to the launch the other day, and so you might have heard a little bit more about the project. But Marcus will tell you a little bit more just before we get started as well. So just to let you know, this lecture is being recorded. So it is. So if you want to be anonymous, please make sure your camera is turned off and your name is changed. And then obviously that means that we won't be able to see you in the recording. And if you do have any questions, you're welcome to pop them in the chat box. If they're technical ones, I'll do my best to help you. If you have a question for Marcus, you are welcome to speak out as well. But we just ask that you keep yourselves muted when you're not speaking, just to avoid any background noise there. Also, because it's a workshop, you are welcome to have your cameras on so we can see you and kind of say hello. But obviously it's completely up to yourself. If you want to keep your cameras off, that's absolutely fine. But it's always nice to see some faces, especially over Zoom. It's always like, yeah, a little bit different, isn't it? It's always nice to see real people. So there's a few more people joining now. So today Marcus is going to be giving us a few different ideas of kind of how to get started with drawing historic buildings. And then we might do a wee drawing exercise as well. So I will hand over to Marcus now, and I'll just keep a wee eye on the waiting room, Marcus, and let anyone else in that's coming. But to a lot of you, Marcus will be reasonably well known if you've been to UAH events before. But I'll just give you a quick bio for Marcus. So he's a retired architect who's drawn buildings all his life. And as he says, he still can't draw a straight line, but he has depicted thousands of buildings in many parts of the world and illustrated a number of books. And he is also the author of one of our bestsellers, the Central Belfast Gazetteer as well. So I will stop sharing my screen and I will hand over to Marcus.
Thanks, Isabel. And hello to all of you. I can see some faces there. It's nice to see a few more if you can turn your cameras on so it doesn't feel like a lecture. It is described as a workshop, but in fact, most of the time I will be showing you pictures. You won't have to look at me all the time. It'll be looking at pictures of other things. And we will stop at one point to do as near as we can to a workshop. But I'll get you one picture which you can try and draw your versions of if you have brought paper and pen and pencil. But I'm not going to teach you how to draw today. You can't do that in an hour and a half. What I will be doing is trying to concentrate on different ways of drawing buildings and understanding buildings, because a lot of the secret of drawing anything is knowing how it's put together, how it works. To draw people, you need to understand anatomy. To draw buildings, you need to understand that one thing piles on top of another and there's another thing takes the rain off and so on. Because they have functional things. Everything about a building is usually functional to a large extent, and understanding that function helps to understand how it puts together and how to draw it. So for those of you who were at the launch the other night, I will be repeating myself a little bit at the beginning because I set out there to try and describe what I was going to be looking for in this challenge in trying to judge the pictures that are presented to us. So you'll see some pictures at the beginning then about this. Now, the first picture, so I've got to share my screen here. Where is that? Share screen. And you should be seeing a picture coming up here. And if I go to slideshow, that should more or less fill your screen, I hope.
Yeah, perfect.
Okay. So the first picture I'm going to show here is a roughly 20-minute or half an hour sketch that I did during the summer. There was a Heritage Townscape Initiative scheme in Armagh, and as part of that I was taking a number of people around the city of Armagh looking at pictures. We had looking at buildings. We had about 3 buildings to do in the course of 2 hours. So this is a 20-minute sketch roughly, because I was talking to other people at the same time. So as you can see, it's not accurate. And that's really one of the first points I want to make. If you want to be accurate, take a photograph or measure things and draw them with your straight line and your pen and pencil and drawing board. Sketching in the street, which is what I'm mainly going to talk about, is about trying to capture the impression you get of the building and the setting and what goes on around it. So I'm not holding this up as a great work of art. It is what I did over the summer when we didn't have much chance to go anywhere, but I did go to Armagh as part of that. And this is a building by Watt and Tulloch, who are quite celebrated Ulster architects from the turn of the century. So I hope that I captured something of the flavour of the building. It's not accurate. There are lots of mistakes in that drawing. So the second thing I want to say is that these are just sketches. So don't look at these and say, these aren't pictures you'd want to put up on your wall. They're pictures I've done for myself. And I hope that the pictures you do are the ones that interest you. You're doing them for your own enjoyment, not for someone else's impression. You're not doing them to sell necessarily. If you do something great, you might be able to sell it. But the point of it is not to produce something for someone else, but to enjoy that process of producing the picture. This is a very small sketch, literally this size, that I did in about 10 minutes at a bus stop in Oxford. And it's only a detail of a much larger building. It's one of the churches on the High Street in Oxford. And the thing I wanted to draw was these barley sugar columns in the front of the building. And I did that in that 10-minute sketch. I think it was actually raining at the time as well, which didn't help. And the water was the watercolor was running the ink and so on, but that didn't matter. What I really liked this little picture, which I did, I say, very quickly. And so you're not looking for necessarily a finished picture. You're looking for something that captures something of the character of the building that you're drawing. Don't think you can't draw. Children can draw, and this is me 65 years ago, and I really wasn't very good at that stage. But I was able to draw something you can tell is a Christmas scene with robins and a house. Now, the difference in a child's drawing and an adult's drawing should be that the child draws what he knows to be there or thinks is there, and the adult should be drawing what he sees as being there. So at this point, I wasn't looking at robins, I wasn't looking at snow, and I wasn't looking at a house. And indeed, I've never seen a house quite like that. That's the way children draw houses: 2 windows and a door and a chimney. And very few houses actually look like that, but it's the sort of imagination that we have of what we know a house to be. When I got a wee bit older, as a teenager, I could draw a wee bit better. I started looking at what was there, and these are still very poor drawings. But in London and Soho Square, I did that when I was about 14. And about the same time, I discovered pen and ink and was able to draw a building in Bangor in a wee bit more detail, just looking at how all the stones worked. So I was learning some of the construction. It's still a rubbish drawing, but at the time I was quite pleased with it. And then as you get more practice, you get more confident in bringing in perspective, being careful with perspective, and putting things together, and then putting in not just the construction of the building, but all the things that go on around it. The broken windows, this is a derelict building in Glasgow, the broken wall, bits of railings, weeds growing up in the garden, all those things become part of the picture. So you get more ambitious as you get more experience. But whatever you do, you will start off with something that is your own. And if you look at it, that is actually the main point. So you stand in front of the building and you're noticing the proportions of different parts, the arrangement of windows and doors, the ways things are ornamented or not, the kind of materials they're built of, and so on. So in this case, you're seeing the coin stones are being different color and different shape from the other stones, coin stones around the windows, lintel stones, porches, dormers, different dormers on top of the building, the thinness of some of the chimneys for the width of them, and so on. So those are all things you notice as you're standing there. And you can think of drawing a building as just a way of seeing a building. It's a tool for seeing. So you'll say, well, you'll give it a go, but wouldn't people stare at you? And I can tell you, in most countries, most people ignore you quite studiously. They don't get mixed up with anything as odd as drawing a building. When people do talk to you, it's usually because they want to tell you something about the building. So you'll learn something of its history, or occasionally people stopping and saying, they want to look at the drawing, and they'll say how much they would like to be able to draw, but can't. And of course, at that stage, your drawing is usually total rubbish anyway. So they could draw just as well at that point. But they'll be impressed by what you're doing because they think they can't draw. And lastly, of these points, and to start off, your drawings should be like a diary, and you should draw everything you see. With its birds flying overhead, or an old lady doing her shopping, sleeping cat, kids playing, the rain coming on, the way the sun moves across the building. And as these things happen, they're part of the experience of experiencing a building. If the weather is awful, do some very rough sketches and work up your picture at home using those sketches as your starting point. This is a pub in Edinburgh, and it's drawn from a flat that one of our sons had at that time. It was a great view of the corner location of that pub and the endless activity going on around it. So I was drawing just a detail again of a building, but the interest of the picture was the pub front itself, but then all the things going on around it, the chat, the smoking, the people calling in the flat next door, the guy duking in to see if his friends are in the pub or not, and so on. So that kind of activity makes the drawing more interesting, and it's part of the record of what you've seen while you've been there. One difference in a photograph and a picture is the photograph is an instant in time, and the picture will be a record of what has happened over the course of time. If you're there for half an hour or an hour, things will happen. So make a quick sketch on the side of the picture, or remember that something happened and fit it into the picture. Maybe you're not quite ready to put that detail in yet, but try and keep it in mind so you can add in the way someone stands, put that in when you get to that bit of the picture. So in doing this challenge, I don't want to see people copying from photographs. There's nothing wrong with photographs, and they're very useful to refer to. And indeed, one of the other challenges, of course, is taking photographs of buildings, but that's a different thing. Doing a drawing is part of there's an emotional side to a drawing or a painting, and it's about the artist as much as it is about the subject. It's that combination of the two things. And as I say, a record of things happening over time. So you can have 2 or 3 things that happened at different times. They can all be fitted into the picture. The photograph can only put in what happened at one time. So I want to see pictures that give the impression of actually having been there and that draw me into the experience of being there. Whatever technique you use, whatever you feel comfortable with, whatever scale you work at, it can be very small or it could be quite large. But it's about you and your experience of the building. So that's the end of my introduction about the challenge and what I'm hoping to see from all of you at the end of this. You have a month, I think, to put in your pictures yet. So this is a summary of what I'm going to be looking at in the rest of the workshop. I'm going to start by showing you work of other artists that I have found very inspirational. And then we'll look at something about materials you could use, a bit about perspective, the question of whether you do your picture out in the open air, sketching in the street, or whether you do sketches and then work it up in the studio. Plein air was the impressionist way of working, and studio has been a more traditional way. The importance of the time of day, the weather conditions, and how that affects your impression of the building, your feeling about the building, how to begin the picture, what to leave out of it, and a bit about understanding buildings, what makes them work the way they do. Briefly, a look at townscape, which is really just putting buildings in a larger picture. And then what I've called the urban theatre, which is coming back to that point from the last picture there, the things that go on around, in and around the building, and that give it life. So to start with, looking at some other artists' work that I have found inspirational. The one I want to start with is a chap called George Scharf, and he was a German who worked in London in the early 19th century. He was actually working as an engraver, so his job was engraving other people's pictures. But what he did in his spare time was drawing everything going on around him in the city. So I can't think of any other artist at that time that would have gone to a street that was being shored up to dig up for making a sewer down the middle of it. It's 1841, he's got the date there. And here is Paul Street in London. These extraordinary timber shores between the buildings, the men working with their pickaxes in the middle of the street, and other people walking by unconcerned. It's not a great work of art, but it is a record of what he saw at that time. There's the pawnbrokers at the corner in that building there. So he's drawing buildings and he's drawing people and what happens around them. This is my favorite one of George Scharf's pictures, a group of shops, and the sheer density of activity in the city, which he's recording here. Out on the street, you have the lady who seems to have stepped in something and is looking cautiously behind her. Other gentlemen keeping the dust down by watering the street and brushing it. And then all the different activity in the different shops, the hatters, the wig makers, the hair cutters. This is also about hair further up here. Patents for something here, the king's patents. And people living in other parts of the buildings further up. That sheer density. And I'm often jealous of George Scharf because I don't think there's anywhere you can go in the British Isles now and find that density, not only of activity of different kinds within the buildings, but also on the street. Most streets now are dominated by cars, and they are not interesting to draw compared to people and the things that people do. This is an artist called Herbert Railton. I came across him when I found this book called Coaching Days and Coaching Ways. Not a particularly promising title, and it's not advertised as a book about art, but he was illustrating history of coaching inns in England. And here he is drawing Judge Jeffrey's lodgings in Dorchester. Railton actually was an architect by training, but made his living mainly as an artist. And I think this is just a superb piece of draftsmanship. We'll come back to that later because I'm going to show you that picture and let you draw it with your pens and pencils for a few minutes. You won't get the whole thing drawn, but taking just a little bit of it and just looking at how that was put together. Here's an artist who, unlike most of the ones that I like, doesn't really use a line particularly. Barbara Jones works much more with tones, and some of you will prefer working that way. If you're working with paint, you may find line is difficult to combine in your picture, and you may prefer to work with different tones of color. Even just in black and white, the different shadows of grays can produce an interesting picture, but of course, adding color in as well will bring it more life. Be careful not to use too much color. Colors in your watercolor tray are quite bright, and in real life, most colors are not terribly bright. They tend to be quite muted by comparison with the colors you start with. So you've got to tone them down a bit. John Piper mainly did prints, lithographs was a particular medium, and he illustrated a lot of buildings as part of that, or gardens. So this is, I think, a lithograph in this case. So there's a combination of different colors, relatively few colors, but line as well to distinguish the building. Oh, I'm getting a little ball there. That's not a good sign. I hope we don't have to come out of this. I may have to come out of this. I'm going to stop share for a minute and come back into that point, hopefully. Hopefully it will work all right. Would you like to say something, Isabel, while I refine myself here?
Yes, well, hopefully already we've got a few ideas just of different approaches that you can take when drawing. I suppose a lot of people automatically think that you're going to be going out with a sketch pad and a pencil and you're going to be kind of lining everything out, but it's good to know that there is different approaches and you don't necessarily even have to use a line, like Marcus was saying with Barbara's work. Now, for other people that weren't at the launch the other day, I'll just do a quick introduction to the actual challenge itself, because I didn't cover that today. So the aim of the overall project is that we are hoping that you will be responding to your local built environment and historic buildings through art. So we are running a series of workshops. So if you haven't checked out our other workshops, please do. We're focusing on 5 different art forms. So drawing and illustration is our first, obviously, today. And then we'll also be looking at poetry with Padraig Regan on Thursday. We'll be looking at prose with John Carson, songwriting with Bridget O'Neill, and photography with Christopher Barr. So there's a few different art forms that you can kind of dabble with and kind of see what you think really helps you to interpret your built environment. I did pop a wee link in the chat box earlier, just so you can find out a little bit more about the challenge as well. So I think that's Marcus back up and running,
Yes,
so I'll hand back to you.
Sorry about that. This is just picking up from where we left off there. The next artist I want to mention was Hugh Casson, who's another architect. He was also president of the Royal Academy. This is maybe 20, 25 years ago, I suppose he was at that stage. And he illustrated a number of books of buildings in London, particularly. And he had a very simple style, which I think is very, very inspiring, easy to copy in a sense, but very difficult to get right. He often used a fountain pen with quite a sketchy line, never looking for a solid line. So it's laid out very, very simply, and then he's added his watercolor in, just blocks of color. And again, you can see here how with relatively few colors, there's maybe a bit of purple in there, a bit of orange in there, but virtually the same color in that whole picture has made it. And yet the sense of shadow, the sense of space within it is all captured very, very simply and very neatly. Oops, going too far there. There's another Hugh Casson here. Again, very simple muted colors, but you can see how he understands his buildings, the massing of this building here, the shadow on that side, setting off light in behind it, the light of the columns there, the dark in behind, and dark trees to set off that pediment. But the whole thing is very loose, and I'm sure done on the spot. There's no sense that this has been prepared studiously at home. It's been done in London at that time. Another artist that has actually published quite a number of books about his work is David Gentleman. He's not only an artist particularly specializing in buildings, he's also designed stamps. And if you go to London, I think it's Charing Cross railway station has what look like jagged woodcuts of medieval builders. Those are David Gentleman's work as well. So he's a very versatile artist, but he does a lot drawing on the spot. He recently did a book of his pictures of London, actually, because that's where he lives. But he's also done books right over the British Isles and indeed right across Europe as well. So this is actually in Oxford, I think, the Botanic Gardens there, a big gateway. And he's done quite an accurate picture of that gateway, the different kinds of rustications on the columns, the shadow under the arch. But he's done it so loosely. The figures have a lot of character, but they're not accurate representations of what's there. It's a gentleman with some kind of +4s and his hose and shoes and so on. But you can tell roughly what he's like, but it's not an accurate picture, nor is the bust on the top. But the feeling of that gateway is very much there. And he's also done slightly decorative pictures of buildings like this, where he's taken that repetitive pattern along, say, an Oxford College or something like that, and he's made a pattern out of it, not looking to get every detail right. These are obviously all identical in reality, but he's got a variety of different sizes of lines, or indeed filling in some bits, not filling in others, some faint lines, some dark lines, and that all gives life and vitality to this picture. But you have that feeling of these repetitive arcades and archways. Another artist who's specialized in topography, maybe not just buildings, but places, is Paul Hogarth. He did a lot of illustrations for the covers of Graham Greene's books, and then did a whole book visiting the places that Graham Greene had based his novels on, which are right across the world. And I think this was actually from one of those books. So he takes buildings and almost makes a caricature of them. This building would not look quite like this. Indeed, it's not a view you could get. I think even with a photograph, you could not get this sort of multiple perspective that he gets. He's looking at this front on, but then he's also looking at the side. So that's almost two different pictures put side by side. And he's probably exaggerated this massiveness of Baroque statuary on the top of the building. So he's made it almost hyper real. He's made something that is more adventurous, more exciting perhaps than what is there in reality. This is certainly one of the Graham Greene pictures. This is, I think, Haiti or somewhere like that. And there's a building at the core of this, but he's as much interested in these varieties of trees around it, in the wall around it, the people, this little sort of hut selling things in front of it. And these combinations of things coming together gives them an interesting composition. And the core of it is that rather grand building, but it's only a part of a bigger picture. An artist that you might be surprised to see in the context of drawing buildings is Ronald Searle. You'll all know his Centrinians cartoons, and they are brilliant. He is a cartoonist first and foremost, but Searle was also quite a fine artist. He did a lot of lithographs and things like that. And he lived in Paris for a large part of his life and did a lot of drawings of Paris. You know that in France, of course, he eats horse meat. So he's put a horse up on the top of this butcher's shop. And he's got this vicious looking butcher hard at work. But I'm sure he's based this on, or even drawn, an actual butcher's shop in Paris. So it has that total reality of what he's drawn, but he's made it super real. He's exaggerated points to make the building like he imagines it might be, rather than just what is there. And of course, cartoons are very much what he does. So here he's contrasting the modern parts of the centre of Paris with the vitality and life of the older buildings in other parts of Paris. And again, the people. So he's got all sorts of activity. He's even taken the cars, which I said make buildings boring, but actually his cars are really quite exciting. He's made them into people in their own right by exaggerating them. And I've thrown in John Glashan here. He's a cartoonist, absolutely. And I put this in just to show how far you can get from reality that you see and still create something that is memorable as an image of a building. So here's John Glashan's version of the Sistine Chapel. I'm not sure how accurate it is, but what he was really interested in was putting up the scaffolding here and imagining Michelangelo painting the Sistine Chapel ceiling and the popes wondering whether it's really what they wanted. So I think John Glashan is great fun as an artist. He's actually much more accomplished than his pictures might at first glance look. And one taking it completely the other direction, Chris Ware, who's a current cartoonist. He's produced a number of very interesting books, including one called Building, and he draws buildings very much as part of his work. This is not something you could do out in the street, but he will do drawings of buildings like that. And what he's done in this particular drawing was to imagine the building as an architect does, looking at a front elevation, looking at a side elevation or an axonometric, looking at a view from above, looking at some of the rooms inside it. So he's imagined the building, it is an imaginary building, I'm sure in this case, and things going on around it. And he's done a drawing around that. So that's just almost a thought that you might put away, but it's an interesting one. So I'm going to say a little bit about materials that you might use, some of which you'll have. If I'm going out to sketch somewhere, I'll have a little bag with me, a little fishing bag, and I'll have a number of sketchbooks, different sizes. A4 is the one I would generally be using. It's a handy size to hold. It's big enough to get quite a bit of detail onto the drawing, but it's not so big that you have to work in a long time on it. but I also have an A5 one for a very quick sketch, or an A3 one I might bring if I think I'm going to work on a particular building and need some large scale images. The paper, when you go to an art shop, you'll see an enormous variety of pads, not just the size, but the different kinds of paper, different kinds of binding. If you're working in the street, you might find it useful to have a spiral bound pad, which you can just turn them over and go on to the next drawing. If you're working quite carefully and don't need to do more than a couple of drawings in the course of your outing, then ones where the paper is simply stuck together is fine, because you can take it off and just put it back in your pad. Smooth and rough. Smooth paper is the cartridge paper you tend to write on and put in your typewriter or in your computer. Rough paper is what watercolor artists tend to use. It's not just because it's rough, but because it gives a texture. The paint doesn't quite lie into the hollows in the paper, so you get little bits of white paper showing through, and that gives an enormous amount of life to the picture. Even the way it sinks into some of those hollows and you get a darker spot at that point, that gives you a texture in the same way as a photographer might like the grain of a real photograph as opposed to the pixelation of a digital photograph. Cartridge paper gives you that kind of texture and life. The weight of paper, 150 gram or 70 pound paper is fine for drawing, and it's a good size for doing a decent drawing. It's not too light, but it's a wee bit light for watercolor. Watercolor, you would tend to use 300 gram or 140 pound paper. It's thick, and it is often rough paper, which isn't easy to draw on, but is lovely for watercolor. You'll need a pencil. Even if you only use the pencil just for doing a very quick outline, just to make sure you've got the proportions and the size of the picture right for your piece of paper. You don't want to find your drawing running off the edge and the best bit just falling off the paper. That's very frustrating. So just doing a very rough sketch to make sure you know where you are on the paper can be helpful. You might want to do your whole drawing on pencil. The trouble with pencil is you've got to be careful it doesn't smudge. If it's a nice soft pencil, it will smudge if you're working on the top bit and you're leaning on the lower bit. A hard pencil won't smudge, but gives you too fine a line, too light a line, and it's not a very lively picture to look at. So for drawing, you generally do want a very soft pencil, but you have to be careful not to smudge. I tend to work with pens a lot. Pens have the advantage of a very crisp line. The disadvantage is once you put the line down, you can't correct it. If you put the line down there, you're stuck with it. And you have to gain confidence that there's nothing wrong with a wrong line. You just work into it as part of the texture you produce. I used to use rotring pens for a long time, the old technical pens that architects and engineers use. They don't use them any longer, so they're hard to get hold of. So I tend to use a marker pen. That's one that I would use a lot now. It's a waterproof ink, and it's supposed to be fade proof. We'll know in 50 years' time. And it's easy to use, easy to carry around. Post office pen is the old dip pens. They're very difficult to work with on site, but if I'm working at home, if I'm revising a picture at home, I'll often use the post office pen, which gives you a much more varied line, livelier line than you get from those others. Watercolors or acrylics. If you're used to oil painting, then acrylics is very much the same thing, but you can use them as watercolors. Acrylics have the advantage they can be a denser color, so you can put a color on, that's the color you're going to get. Watercolor often works by laying colors on top of one another, and the excitement often comes from what comes through. You lay a bit of green on, then you put a red on top, and you get a different color, and it will vary according to the variations of color you've laid down. Watercolor is transparent, and it means you can actually work over your line. And say it's transparent, it's not entirely transparent. So if you actually want your line to be really strong, you put the watercolor down first and then come back onto the pen afterwards. If you put watercolor on top of the pen, it will go a bit grayer. It will not have the crispness of the color, the line being laid on top. I always have a candle end, and it can be quite small. literally a candle end, and that's for giving you a wax resist. You can do too much of it. You can use a lot of it in a picture. Henry Moore did his famous pictures of the underground sleepers using a lot of wax resist. But it's very useful for just a small bit where you want it, paper to come through, and yet you want a big loose wash. So it's a very useful tool. Wax crayons, colored crayons can be useful as well. Your brush, there's different kinds of brushes. Don't use too fine a brush because it will not carry enough paint and it will look too academic. A bigger brush is more useful. This is one I tend to use. It's a flat brush, so it's thin in one direction, thick in another. And with the thick dimension, I can lay quite a dense wash on very easily. But with the finer one, I can get more detail. You need to carry water around with you, a little jar like that to carry your water. And that's for sketching in the street. If you're working on a final version and you may decide that you like your sketch, but you want to make something more detailed of it, you might end up doing a bigger picture, A3 or bigger, A2 even. And with that, you might just take your cartridge paper and you'll soak it and stretch it and put gummed paper around the edge and set it on a board. And it dries then with a taut finish. And as you put paint onto it, it doesn't cockle the way it would if it didn't have that stretched appearance. Or you might produce a screen print, which I do quite a lot of. Screen printing, you would do your drawing with separations on drafting film, and then you print them all separately to make up the screen print. I'll show you some screen prints as part of this. I don't expect that many of you will do it unless you've already worked with screen print or are wanting to join a print workshop. I'm a member of the Belfast Print Workshop. If you live in Bangor or that direction, then Seacourt has an excellent print workshop as well. And it's a way of making different kinds of images and maybe a more finished image than you would do in the street, certainly more finished. Or you might choose etching. And etching, usually, again, you're doing it as a print done afterwards in your studio or in a print workshop. Whistler did etchings on the spot, again, in London in the 19th century. He carried out his acid, his copper and so on, and he would actually etch the plates on the spot. That's not a common thing to do. Still one artist, I think, still does that. So that's where I'm going to stop now and let you have a closer look again at the, I'm going to find my way back to the Herbert Railton picture. So if you get your pencil and pen and paper, and we're going to stop at the Herbert Railton picture. Here we are. And I say, you won't have time to draw all of that. There's a lot of lines, but do look at bits of it. Just take a bit like that and see what he's doing with the lines, or the way he's showing the shadows there, or the way he shows brickwork there, not by outlining each brick, but by putting in the shadow. Or the way he's showing the shape of something here with the hatching coming in underneath it. So we'll just take 5 minutes here and just get your paper out and just draw bits of that appeal to you. I think it's a superb piece of draftsmanship. It's using a pen and ink, a dip pen. So he's able to get thick and thin lines, which you can't do so easily with a pencil or with a conventional modern pen. But you may get hold of a dip pen and find you like this. There are all sorts of little details in it, and just carry on drawing, but I'm going to just highlight a few things. These little spots he's put in here, which indicate a line, but he hasn't put the line in. He's avoided putting lines by and large. It's only when he has to define something like a downpipe, he's shown a line here, but even that isn't a full line, it's broken. And on the other side, he doesn't even show the full line of the downpipe. He doesn't want to overemphasize it because it's not that important, but it does help to delineate the shape of this eaves. When he comes to shadows, he's got lines where he can put them close together to get a heavy shadow and a darker line leading more heavily with his pen. He's even scribbled a few things in solid black, but he doesn't use that much solid black. He's quite sparing in his use of solid color. When it comes to the little casement windows, you can see some which are square windows, some which are diamond lattice. And again, he doesn't draw literally everything from frame to frame. He puts in enough to give the line and the shape of it, but he stops short of the frame. So the frame becomes an important element in its own right. And even it isn't drawn literally as a rectangle, he's broken it up. You may wonder why breaking up a line works so well. It's giving life to the line. It lets each line have its own character. Whereas if you draw a rectangle, you tend to be too geometric about it. By drawing lines in their own right, it's the force of putting that line on that comes out and is read. When he comes to do the shadows under the oriel, it doesn't matter that everyone is slightly different. He hasn't tried to get them all regimented. In fact, they're not regimented, and deliberately gives a life to it. Looking at that shadow there, it wouldn't be like that in reality. It would almost certainly be a more even size of shadow, but it's given a wonderful feeling of the age of the building. And he's taken the same thing out with the gutter being pushed out from the building through time. It's not a straight line gutter here. Some of the timbers in the roof have pushed out bits, other bits have collapsed because the support for the gutter has failed. You can see the supports for the gutter in there. Several of those lines are the holder bats, as they're called, that support the gutter. These are jettied medieval buildings, and there's nothing like this in Northern Ireland, unfortunately. But when you go to England, you will find buildings like this, or indeed on the continent, where if they were on a street, the street had to be wide enough for carts and so on to move through it. But as they could go further up the building, they could project out, because it didn't matter about projecting into that space. So often you ended up with buildings quite close together at the top floors, but spaced apart at ground level. I'll give you another minute to finish your sketch there, or to just admire the penmanship here, and then we'll move on. I hope this is giving you some ideas. It's not to copy buildings like drawings like this, but copying these things does give you techniques that you can apply in your own drawings. And if you're using pen or pencil, this process of hatching, it's called, this small lines side by side, or indeed cross hatching, which you have up here, where he puts lines going one direction and then darkens it by putting lines going another direction. And changing that as you go through, it doesn't become too mechanical. He has a lot of life in his hatching. It's not simply big lines put across the whole drawing. So techniques like that are very useful to have. They help to give light and shade, and indeed some life to your drawings. So I think you've had 5 minutes of that. It's time to move on to some other things. So I'm going to go away from that and back to where we were in the PowerPoint. And I'm going to talk about some techniques now for drawing buildings, techniques you need to know about. And perspective is one of the first things that people will talk about when you're, particularly when you're drawing buildings. You need it when you're drawing building or people as well. There's a perspective across a face, but buildings particularly lend themselves to it because they tend to be geometrical shapes in themselves. I should say this is also a screen print. It's not a watercolor done on the spot, but I did sketches on the spot. I did 2 sketches on the spot. In fact, I did one of this gateway, and I did another of what I could see through the gateway of this building, because I was drawing this at street level, not up in the building opposite. So this is actually looking at multiple perspectives. So I have 2 different drawings almost in the same picture, and the different perspectives attached to them. And while I've got that first building almost drawn front on, in the side buildings, you'll see I have a wee bit of perspective as you see the building set forward there. I've just shown that line to indicate that that is forward of the rest. And there on the other side, it goes the other direction. So that's a very simple perspective. Here's the way perspective is theoretically laid out. I say theoretically because it produces rubbish results if you try and do this. This is taking a very simple building like this. And if you look at all the lines here, they're going in a direction like that. All the ones at the ground floor, ground level are going upwards to a thing called the vanishing point. And the vanishing point is your eye level. So all the way across the building, that is your eye level. Everything above it goes to a vanishing point or up to a vanishing point. And if you look at the other side of the building, lo and behold, it's going to a different vanishing point. It's sort of magic. But that's how, if you chose your vanishing point the same direction, you'd be looking at the corner of the building dead on. As you look at one side of a building or another, the vanishing points go to different directions. You can't fit those vanishing points usually onto your picture. They're theoretical. But if you're laying out a formal perspective, as architects used to have to do, you would have your vanishing points and your eye point all there. So that's called two-point perspective. And here is a very, very loose version of it when you come to look at a building in reality. This is not a very good example, but you'll see this is actually a hill going down here. So the eye level point is roughly here. Everything here is roughly the same line. Everything above it on this side is looking to go down that direction, and they're going to a vanishing point. These get steeper and steeper as you get further up, and they're going to a vanishing point somewhere outside the picture. Same on this side. These things also going to a vanishing point way, way off the picture, somewhere way down at the bottom of the Royal Mile. This is another Edinburgh building. And because there's also a curve here, these buildings actually do something else. They stretch out slightly. So it's a slightly complicated picture. But in putting that together, even very roughly, I've drawn some lines with the pencil, usually first, just to see where the lines would work on a line going to that vanishing point. Then there are different ways you can project your picture, as they call it. So architects used to draw axonometric and isometric projections of a building. So this is a picture of a brick. The axonometric one, your vertical lines are vertical, your horizontal lines are horizontal, but they also go off at an angle of 45 degrees. And you can measure these. These are all measurable dimensions. It's not like a perspective. That's exactly the same distance as that. Isometric is a bit more realistic. So it's a 30-degree angle. Again, your verticals are vertical, but your baselines tend to be at 30 degrees rather than 45 degrees. And that's a more realistic picture. But you can look at the top of a building. Everything is from the same aerial view, if you like. So here's a building sort of done in a sort of an axonometric. It's not formal axonometric, but roughly 45 degrees takes you to that angle from the horizontal at the front. This is the bank I used to go to in Bangor, and they've actually sold it now. They've abandoned it. At the time I had it, my account there, they said they were going to demolish the building because they wanted to get a new safe in. And I said I would take my overdraft away, and they left the building at that time, but they have abandoned it since. So it's no longer a bank, but it's a lovely Edwardian building. And this is a screen print again, I may say, rather than a watercolor done on the spot. So I've had time to work out my perspectives on the building and how I wanted it to look. And I've shown brickwork there, not by lines of brickwork, but by using the old candle wax to get a white line, which roughly represents the mortar. It's not realistic, but it does indicate where the lines of the brickwork go. This is another screen print, and this is a form perspective that I'm calling real life perspective, because real life isn't straight lines. It's actually curved lines. If you look up at the ceiling above yourself, if you're looking at an angle between your wall and your ceiling, you'll see that line goes off in each direction. It doesn't come together like that. It does something more like that. And you can see it disappearing to those vanishing points, but it doesn't crash like that in the middle. It does that. So in real life, the perspective lines are curves. And that's sort of drawn in this picture of Queens. The vertical lines are more or less vertical. Again, in reality, as you look at something, they also tend to diverge or converge together, a bit like a wide angle photograph converges all the vertical lines. And when you look at things, there's a bit of an element of that as well. This is a building where I've taken that to a slightly more extreme, but again, it's drawn in front of this building. It's in Prague. There's the Dvorak Museum there, and the wall is actually more or less straight, but I've drawn it curved because as you stand in front of the wall, it disappears in both directions, and it disappears upwards to the vanishing point as well as downwards to it. So it appears to be curved, and the building itself, it doesn't have really a straight roof. It's a Baroque roof anyway, but it tends to have a bit of a curve to it. And the curve to the railing is not a real thing, but it's something which you tend to see. And it gives a liveliness to the drawing. So there's a good reason for doing it for aesthetic reasons, as well as trying to record in a way what you're seeing. This is the Folk Museum of Cultural, and this is a picture that I would call using multi-point perspective. So a bit like the one I started with, I did a picture of these people picnicking in front of the hedge. I did a picture of the old thatched cottage here, and they did a picture of the market square. And that involved standing in 3 different positions. This isn't a screen print. It was done on an A3 page, and it's done on the spot, but done in 3 different spots to give that impression. So I had to know roughly what I was going to do, and then I'm constructing the picture as I go along. It's not a view that I could see at one point. And this is also a constructed viewpoint. This is a screen print again, so there's more time to think about the construction. It's the old school in Belmont Road, which I'm sure many of you know. And it's a stone building, so you've got the nice texture of the stonework, the darker color of stone around the window openings. But the main feature of the building is this belfry. And I thought, if I do a picture of the building from ground level, the belfry is going to be quite small. But if I do it from a bird's eye view, the belfry will be the biggest thing and the rest of the building will be less important. So it was a way of, it's a cartoon of the building, if you like, but it is trying to pick out what is characteristic about it and then focusing on that, whether you make it with a thicker line or you make it bigger than the rest of the picture. There's different ways you can do that. It's not essential to do that. I quite enjoy doing it. You might be much more literal in your approach. I've also indicated other houses round about just with very, very loose lines with a brush. And then I put the children playing around it, which they don't any longer because the school is now there. This is now a National Trust property. And here I've done something I'm calling distorting perspective, which is something you do not get taught in architecture school, or indeed probably in art school. But when you stand out in a street and you think what you want to make the main point of your picture, this is in Dublin, it's the Olympia Theatre, and it has this wonderful sort of late Victorian Art Deco, Art Nouveau, leaded glass portico. And I wanted that to be the main thing in the picture. It's not as big as that in reality. So I've drawn it as if it was coming out of the building at you. And then having done that, I was able to play with other lines in the picture as well, and just to play around with perspective. So it's made what is a relatively straight line of buildings into something more decorative without, I hope, losing contact with the character that the buildings have. And it's certainly tried to put that portico in a context. Now, the next thing I wanted to bring up, I should say, are there any questions? Do interrupt me if there are any questions, or Isabel, have you seen any things in the chat line?
No, not yet. But if anyone does have any questions, please feel free. If you'd rather put them in the chat box, you can, or Marcus is happy for you to unmute if you've got any questions and you can ask it. So now's your chance if you have anything, but we'll come back to any questions at the end if there's anything else that crops up as well.
Okay. Well, I'll go on for the moment. I'll say do ask questions if you want. The next thing I wanted to cover was whether we do a picture plein air or in the studio. And I think plein air is very important to do the sketch of the building beginning, even if you end up constructing your picture more in the studio to make a more finished picture. But the important bit to me is always being out there in reality, drawing what is there. And I put two pictures here side by side. The one on the left is just some old farm buildings around Dungannon on a very cold day. And it was so cold, you can see the snow on the ground, that the paint was actually freezing as I was putting it on the paper. So you can see an enlargement there of some of these lines around here where the water had crystallized. So the paint has a crystallized appearance from the way it froze on the paper. I didn't expect that to happen, and it's not happened very often. Usually wind is more of a problem than freezing, but it's interesting when it does. On the other hand, I decided many years ago to draw a bonfire. This is in the days when bonfires were a bit smaller and didn't have quite so many rubber tires on them. Indeed, they had not just pallets, but also doors and things like that. So I was interested in the structure of the bonfire, realizing that it is something you don't see in other countries. It is a Northern Ireland thing, for better or for worse. And I was interested in how it would burn as well, seeing just what happens when the fire happens. So I drew it that the afternoon of the 12th, or the 11th rather, to see what the construction of the bonfire was. And then I went back at night with a very rough sketch of the shape of the bonfire to work from, and I sketched what was actually happening when the bonfire started. Now, I can tell you in this case, the watercolor was drying as soon as I put it on the paper. So it was the absolute opposite of the freezing appearance. And the painting I did on the spot was total rubbish. But the next day I did this, which is based on what I saw, using the sketch and developing it with more things happening from it. So the bonfire being burnt, I realized that I started at the back of the crowd drawing the bonfire. Within 20 minutes, the crowd had retreated into the streets round about, and I was at the front of the crowd, or indeed quite a few yards in front of the crowd, and with my paint drying away. So I was interested in what happened there. The hoses playing on the gable to keep it from burning as well, kids running about, the lamppost burning from the sheer heat of the fire, and it was enormously hot. You don't realize the heat of those fires and how quickly a fire takes off. Quite a warning if you ever think about fires on buildings. So that's what I was going to say about that. The next thing is times and weather, because again, when you're out in the open air doing your sketch, whether it's just a loose sketch or whether it's something you make up into something more finished, the time of day and the kind of weather changes your perception of a building. This is Tollymore Forest Park, it's the Hermitage there. And the time I went there, it was pouring with rain. I had an A3 sketch pad with me, and I did a sketch which looked roughly like that. I was mainly interested to see what happens with the rain falling through the trees onto the water below, and trying to record that in such a way that I could make a decent picture the next day or that night. So this is the finished picture then done the next day. And it's very close to what I saw, I hope, but I put a few things in. Again, the candle wax gives me the impression of the steps without making them too important, and just giving me some resist for some of the rocks there. But it's been drawing the kind of, the weathering on the buildings, the rough stones, the ferns, the moss that grow onto an old building like that, and then some feeling of the wateriness of that experience. This is a building in Switzerland, and Switzerland isn't always nice, clear views of the Alps. They have lots of days of rain. This was in Zurich. It's a building which, where it's a theatre actually, where Brecht put on a lot of his premieres of his plays. So it's not a most exciting building itself, but that's just a grey building, but with some quite interesting classical detailing on it. But the thing that made the picture was the fact that I realized that everyone had their umbrellas up because it was pouring with rain. I was in a bus shelter or something like that, trying to draw it. This is done on the spot, but not out in the rain. I found a shelter point and then drew everyone else with their umbrellas. You can't carry an umbrella while you're sketching. Unfortunately, you've got to find shelter to do it. This is in Australia, in Brisbane, and we were here just as a cyclone was coming in from North Australia, and it arrived in Brisbane with her torrential rain. There was a break in the rain, and I thought I would get this little picture done on an A5 sketch pad, so it's a very small sketch, and I had done the watercolor of the railway station. Actually, I did it, the watercolor of it, and then the rain came back on, and it literally washed all the paint off the paper. I was left with white paper again. So I went to a bus shelter, as I should have been in the first place. I didn't get quite the right viewpoint. And I recreated the picture in the bus shelter. So you can see that the watercolor is still running into the still wet paper there, but then the line comes on as it begins to dry up a bit. So that was done quite a short time. Well, between the redoing of the picture was probably half an hour, and I'd probably spent 10 minutes putting on paint that got washed off. So, but the experience of doing that was memorable and interesting. And then earlier this year, I decided to get up very early one morning and draw the view from our spare room. And it's a view of, not a very interesting view of buildings, but I was interested in the fog. And so even in the fog, you would think you can't do much with buildings, but with very few lines, except on the tree, which is close to me, the buildings were almost all just indicated with tone, and indeed not much color. The only color really was when people got up and lit windows, or got a car set off from here, and there were headlights and that sort of thing. The opposite of that, another early morning, this was in Australia, and they have these lovely our sort of Metroland bungalows with pan-tile roofs, almost identical size, but different details on them. And in a lot of streets in Australia, they really look after their big trees. They don't chop them back the way we do. And they're all different kinds of trees. So I was interested in the combination of this wonderful big tree and the variety in these two houses. And then while I was there, the moon was still up there and a balloon floated across. So it's what happened while I was there. It wasn't made up. I didn't add the balloon because it would look nice. It was there and it did look nice. So things like that happen. This is Edinburgh Castle. And if you know Edinburgh, you'll know the castle is a Georgian building, basically, Scottish close-step castellations, and it's built on this basalt rock, the old core of a volcano, and there are paths up to it. And at 1 o'clock every day, they set off a gun, and that's the gun, and that's the smoke from the gun. So I was there for an hour or so, I suppose, but during that, for 2 seconds, there was smoke from the gun and the bang. So you put that into the picture. Any more questions? Still quiet?
Yeah, still quiet.
Okay. So the next topic I was going to bring up was how to begin your picture. And the first question is, how much time do you have? If you've only 5 or 10 minutes, that's a 5 or 10 minute sketch. Just enough to indicate the kind of roof that that building had. It was a corner turret with an oriel and a door in the corner. You can't tell any more than that. There's no time because that was just a very quick sketch. I think I put the watercolor on first, an indication of the next door building, and then added the line very, very loosely. No pencil sketch or anything like that, it's just straight on. So it's very rough, but it does give a character. Or if you have 3 or 4 hours, you can stand with an A3 pad in Dublin and Delair Street and draw a building like that. And that is a lot of work. Takes a pencil line, first of all, to make sure that everything's going to be roughly in proportion. You're not going to run out of space somewhere and that things are going to fit in. No point in drawing every brick. I could draw you a close-up of that, and you'll see that some bricks I've shown just the shadow, others I've shown the mortar lines, others I've left out altogether, but it indicated that they were there. So if you try and draw everything, you will end up with, yes, an accurate picture, showing exactly every bit of faience stonework or faience tile work there, and every brick, but it would be slightly dead. So it's a lesson from Herbert Railton's drawings, where he was a master of indicating things when they needed to be indicated, leaving them out when your imagination could fill them in, or indeed when, with modern ground floors, so often they really weren't that interesting. So you're trying to indicate all the important things of the building, and leaving out the things that detract from it. So that first question is how much time, and then your size of picture will be dictated by that, your medium, the technique you're going to use, and the question of how much detail you're going to put in. This is Central Park in New York, which is an enormous space with absolutely no buildings in it. And all around it, there are enormous buildings. And I wanted to do a picture showing the contrast between Central Park with these natural rocks and grass at the edge of it, and these lowering skyscrapers all around. And so that's done on the spot. And I also realized when I went to New York that the scale of the buildings was such that you simply could not put in the details I would expect to be able to put in to a building here. If they're 40 stories higher, whatever they are, you can only indicate a few of those. Indeed, those are probably far larger than they should be, but just enough to indicate the massing, the shapes of the buildings, and the fact that there were windows or different kinds of levels on the buildings. And then the trees were quite light little trees by comparison with those masses. This is another very simple sketch, just to indicate the wonderful dome here, the features below the dome and the palm trees and these big steps. So it's again done in 15 minutes, maybe 20 minutes, while waiting for something else. So sometimes these three sketches work well, sometimes they're total rubbish. They are hit and miss. You can never be sure how they're going to work out. And you maybe don't know at the beginning just what you're going to depict. With these, I would usually put the watercolor on first. I have to take care putting it on to make sure I've got the shape of the dome roughly right, and these shapes here, and then putting on a few lines afterwards. If I put the lines on first, I would tend to put too many lines in. And part of the enjoyment of this picture, I think, is that the lines are relatively sparse, but they do define things. Having those spots of the portholes defines the dome in a way that it's much more difficult with watercolor alone. This is trying to look at the characteristic features of a Georgian house. This is Castle Ward, and it was a cover for a report we did about Castle Ward years ago. And I did it as a small drawing, which I then printed as a screen print onto paper. So the background of this is Angora paper, which is paper with a horizontal line through it. You can get that in different colors, creamy colored or blue or common colors. And then I screen printed a white onto that. And then I screen printed the drawing onto it at a third level. The drawing originally was a small ink drawing this size. It was enlarged slightly for the screen printing. But Georgian buildings, just to stop for a minute and look at Castle Ward, it's a very characteristic building. The ground floor is often what they call rusticated, these horizontal lines, and they break up over the windows, but there's still that feeling of a horizontal line. It tends to be a string course that stands out of the building above that level. And then you've got two floors perhaps above that. The main one is the first floor with the balconies there. In Georgian buildings, this is called the piano nobile from Renaissance buildings in Italy or Venice and places like that, where the main living room was on the first floor. So these are usually the tallest windows in a Georgian building. And the attic floor, the windows are much smaller. And you get features like a giant order column, which is not just an order like you might have around these windows, but a giant order runs through two floors and supports the pediment up above here. That's your pediment. And you have the frieze and cornice and so on here. This tends to overhang quite a bit from the building. and sometimes urns in this case, or coats of arms in the pediment, or it might be statues in the corners. And then in a Georgian building, the roof is quite shallow. So if you're standing back from the building, you see the roof. When you're close to it, you don't see the roof at all. So this is an architectural perspective. I'm relatively close to it, but I'm imagining what height of the roof and the chimneys actually are. In Georgian buildings, you're not meant to notice the roof. Victorians loved roofs. So that's just picking out a few architectural features. I'm going to show you the difference in a rough sketch and a finished picture, and showing how they each have their different virtues. This is a rough sketch, literally 15, 20 minutes, of a group of buildings outside Dublin, the outskirts of Dublin. This is the Martello Tower, which features at the beginning of Ulysses. And beside it, there's a modernist building by Michael Scott, and then a vernacular building in between. So I love that combination of three entirely different buildings, a lovely tree, and then the wall and people walking along this walkway here. So I was able to put those features in. It was a dark day. It was raining a lot of the day as well. So that's your dark sky. There's the white that you get left from using watercolor on rough paper. You see the rough edges in that. I couldn't have painted that, but by taking your brush very quickly across and not trying to fill in all the gaps, you get some of these things lying there. And you can see the darker bits where the paint sits into the paper as well, particularly somewhere like that. So that was the rough sketch, but I was doing it to make a print from it, a screen print from it. And this is the screen print. Now it's more accurate. You can see details in the Martello Tower that you couldn't see in the sketch. You can see much more what Michael Scott's house looks like with its flat surfaces and these big picture windows, and the vernacular building in there. And the tree is more carefully done. I quite like the sky, which is not carefully done. But there's actually somehow less life in that than there was in that sketch. So they have their own different values. But the screen print was the finished picture in that case. This is a more detailed watercolor, not done on the spot. Sketches were done on the spot, and then the watercolors constructed, stretched out paper. This was A3 size or a bit larger, and this picture is done after the time of doing the pictures. But at the time, I had to be on the spot to try and work out the perspective I was going to get, the way I was going to get the stream in to provide interesting foreground and the trees here without dominating the building. The reason I didn't put that building in close to is because it has plastic windows, and to draw it close to, it would have been rather a dull building, but its setting was lovely. So that was the way of making that building more exciting perhaps than it might have been otherwise. And it is a beautiful setting. This is a case of drawing in ink first and the watercolor was added later. The drawing was done on the spot. Some of you might remember this building. It's what was there before Castle Court was built. So this was 1985. I did this. This was the old head post office, which is a wonderful big stone building. That's the Grand Central Hotel with its little dome. And beyond that, so Forum Club and Droppers and Cleavers, which are still there. But these buildings were being demolished at the time I was drawing that. And the memorable thing was the fact that while I was doing that, I could smell the pine, pitch pine from the piling of the building as they were drawing the piling up from the ground. You could smell the resin in it. So that was a totally memorable part of that experience. Usually I would actually tend to do watercolor first and add the line afterwards. The line is crisper, it's not accurate, so you end up with things where the color is in the wrong place, and it doesn't matter. It's part of the characteristic of the way that watercolors work. I'm nearing the end of my time, so I'll move a wee bit faster over the next wee bits. A bit about understanding buildings. When you go to different places, you find different techniques being used. This is in Fife, the east coast of Scotland, where there was a lot of lovely red stone with the native stone, but the roofs were often covered in pan tiles. And the pan tiles have been brought from Holland as ballast, coming back from things that they'd exported to Holland. So a lot of pan tiles used in the roofs. But with Scottish rain, if you just had the pantile roof, the rain would shoot down through the hollows of the pantiles and overrun the gutter into the street. So they actually break the line of the roof with slates, as you can see there. So that's a fife detail, which is very characteristic and very important in terms of telling you where you are. That breaks the line of those rushes of water, and they can put it into a gutter and carry the water away. These are buildings in Essex. When I mentioned the just jettying out of buildings I looked at in the Herbert Railton picture, these are a mixture of Georgian and medieval buildings. And you can see different ages of windows, the small, tiny windows here in this, which is very early, the much later windows here or here. And this is probably quite a relatively recent building. Some of these have been refronted at later times. The church is the same kind of age, but still stone. Here's a lovely early shop front. So that wonderful group of buildings has all sorts of different age, and you have to see the detail to show the different ages of the buildings. And because the buildings are white, it made sense to put a grey sky behind to set them off. So it wasn't actually a grey day when I was there, but it was necessary to put something up behind it to outline that. These are buildings in Hastings. Now, Hastings is a fishing village, or it's a fishing town, and on the shore in Hastings, there are these net drying sheds. So they're timber buildings covered in tar. How do you draw a black building? And I looked at those for quite some time before I realized that I could use a combination of drawing the line of the timber and using candle wax again. Candle wax is magic stuff. You don't use very much of it. You don't use it all the time, but that's the kind of thing that gave it a lot of variety. I couldn't have done, I think, any other way. You might pick a detail of a building rather than doing the whole thing. Big Baroque door case like this with flags from it. This is in Bratislava. The rough watercolor put in and then the line added afterwards, and you can be quite free with your line. It doesn't matter about the detail. You have the feeling here, hopefully, of this massive Baroque doorway. Even modern buildings can be interesting to draw. They tend not to be as interesting to draw because there's so many straight lines. I did quite like this one for its combination of, at that time, it was quite a novel thing, seeing a screen. It's a newspaper building, The Age is the Melbourne's newspaper. And so this was advertising the latest headlines and so on as a screen on the building. And the combination of different massings here with the trees, with the lawn, with the people in front of it did seem to make an interesting building. That's quite a small one, A5. Townscape, when you put your buildings together, is always more difficult than picking an individual building. If you want to be very quick with your picture and very simple, draw it straight on. Much the easiest thing. Drawing buildings in a street is really quite tricky, and we all tend to stretch them out far more than they are in reality. So again, a bit of pencil sketching to try and make sure you get the proportions right. But these buildings are so narrow in reality, it's quite hard to get the detailing in. But that is the characteristic of the streetscape with the tar at the end of it. This is New York again, and New York has extraordinary townscapes which aren't just flat, not one level. The sheer height of the buildings and the different levels of buildings going on at one time. This was a sketch of fairly uninteresting building here with the activity going on in the street below it. And then above it in the sunlight, older buildings and the water towers, which you see all across New York. So that combination of relatively quite dull buildings in shadow and the lively buildings in sunlight was interesting. This is Melbourne again. Melbourne has a lot of Victorian buildings, but at the edge of the city, there are masses of tall office blocks. And they're not interesting in themselves, but there was something about this sheer busyness of townscape going on with these massive office blocks in behind, the railway going on here, the trams down at this level, train crossings, buses, people everywhere. And I found that quite a challenge to do. That's a bigger picture, that's A3, that one. And finally, urban theatre, things that go on in around the buildings, which help to tell you where you are, when you are, and what people use the buildings for. This is Rome. one of these wonderful squares with Baroque statues and fountains and tiers of activity and columns and arches and columns for representing events and so on. And then in amongst that, people walking up a staircase here, roads going down this way. The sheer variety of activity and people walking in the square in front was just fascinating. So that was lovely to draw, and it tells you so much more than just doing a literal drawing of, say, these Baroque sculptures in themselves. And rather similarly, this is in Australia again, and there are some of these modernist buildings which cantilever out over tall hills on the edge of the bay in Melbourne. And I'd drawn this one because it seemed to have an interesting staircase up to it and these little houses below it. And I thought that was how you got up to the house. And then I saw, because again, you're here for a time. Photograph would just be a picture of the building and you go. But when you draw it, you're there for 3/4 of an hour, something like that. And towards the end, the people drove back in their car, put it in the garage. Then they appeared here and they had a little escalator taken them to the top. So they didn't have to walk up the staircase. And I wouldn't have seen that if I hadn't been around for that length of time. This is in Ukraine, a medieval building with massive sculpture, but so black that unless you'd gone up to the sculptures individually, you couldn't really make out what they were, but just see the busyness of that. And while I was there was a fashion shoot going on. So this is the photographer shooting one of the models in front of the building. There was others cycling around and so on. This is in Poland, and the mixture of modern buildings with a medieval tower and a Renaissance town hall, and the people in the cleaning shed here, the cleaning station, smoking their fags and so on before going out to do their work. Just an extraordinary combination of things. And here where a town square has been taken apart, they've excavated to make an underground car park. But they've left the palm trees round about it. And they've left the statue of Mr. Cavallo, or whatever his name was, and supported that on these stanchions while they're working on the car park. It's probably all filled in again now, and he'll be on ground level, just as he was always intended to look. Stations with masses of people coming around, the sheer numbers of people coming in and out, pouring in and out of a big railway station like that is what the picture's about. The building gives you the setting, and the people are the activity and the story. Or in Vienna, if you've seen the film of The Third Man, you remember the Zentralfriedhof, the central cemetery, with the long walkways through it and these massive Baroque tombs. So this is that's where that is, and people bring their watering cans out to water the plants, and these typical Viennese ladies. As you can see, I started to draw the railing, and then she arrived. I had to put her in, so she's put in during the course of the picture. Or in Italy, where they're getting ready for a procession around this village, and they're all dressed up as Roman soldiers or Christians or people in the flagellants, in their what look like Ku Klux Klan hoods, ready to go around in the later part of the procession, flagellating themselves. But they're all gathering here to process. And they didn't mind at all that we were drawing them. If we'd been there with a movie camera, they would have objected because this was private. But because we were drawing, we were part of the scene. My wife was drawing as well. And we were both just part of what happened. It was part of the day. Photographer doesn't have that privilege. You also can draw people walking around, and the people in different cities have different characteristics. This was in Boston, and they were all walking around with their coffee. Now everyone does that, but at that time that was unusual. Or in Switzerland, you find the train ticket collector has a very elaborate system. He can take the same train for the boat, and he takes bits of this ticket and bits of that. It's a very complicated calculation. So I had time to draw him while he was calculating the value of a ticket. This is back in Belfast, and I did say, when you're drawing, people don't pay any attention to you. Occasionally people do. I showed you the picture of the Ormer Road pub, there was a small guy did get in touch. In this case, I think it was this girl said, would you put me in the picture? So I put her in, and then she realized that I'd drawn people standing on the or sitting on the wall here. And she said, oh, it's Billy and Dave or whatever they were. And said, they'll put the flag up for you. And there was a flag up there, but it wasn't properly freed. So they climbed up onto the roof and I put in them. By the time I'd drawn them as well, there were a few other friends came along to be drawn. So one by one, they were added into the picture. I was going to do originally a picture of street gables with a pile of rubbish in front of it, and it just grew beyond that. And that was very much the fun of being there. And they were all very polite, and they posed carefully, and they brought along the baby to be drawn as well. So it was fun. And you don't go out knowing that's going to happen. You can't expect it, and you just have to be open to things happening. And I'm going to finish with taking things beyond the literal looking, which is the starting point. You might decide that you're building such an interesting history that you're going to tell a story about it and do a picture that takes the building into a different context. Hopefully you can tell that this is a County Antrim farmhouse. It's actually an imaginary one in this case, but there's the characteristics of being quite low-lying, maybe with corbels or coinstones rather on the side, usually symmetrical, but not necessarily exactly symmetrical, often with chimneys in each gable, and the small fields around it, and the way the fields peter out onto the top of the hills as you come onto the Antrim Plateau is very characteristic. So this was an imaginary picture. It was a Christmas card for UTV. They just got this new mobile van, and it had to be put into a picture. So I had them interviewing Santa, or about to interview Santa. Similarly imaginative, this is Paris in the time of Proust. Imagining what it might have been like if Proust could have had a delivery of his Madeleines by Amazon. So this is Amazon Madeleine vans arriving outside very characteristic Parisian houses with their mansard roofs and the balconies. Or this one, which some of you will remember, the Orpheus building, which is part of the old co-op and then became part of the art college. It originally had a ballroom on the top floor, and people would have gone there to dance. But I drew this knowing it was going to be demolished as part of the university's development there. So this is imagining what was going to happen next with the bulldozer moving in and pulling the building apart. Some students looking bewildered there. And then something of what might happen in the future, which is nearly there now, the very big buildings taking its place. So this is putting 3 different timescales into one building. It's a screen print again. And again, not something you do on the spot, but there were drawings on the spot to help to make that up. And this is a building we'd worked on, Portrush Town Hall. So we'd finished restoring the building and putting a new extension on here. And I wanted to do a screen print to record it. And I did it as it would have been if the Northwest cycling race had arrived. So I did draw buildings here on the ground. I went and drew some of the cyclists and so on. And then I made up this imaginary viewpoint of the building, looking down at it from a bird's eye viewpoint, looking at all the racers and the police van and everything else going on around it. So it's not imaginary, but it is storytelling. It's adding things in which you couldn't have seen all at one time. Or again, taking a Victorian semi-detached house. There's the division between the 2 parts of the house. There's the neighbour cutting the hedge, someone else climbing the tree, and all the activity that goes on when you have a house full of children and lodgers and so on. And occasionally a balloon will go across while you're drawing it, and that happened then as well. So I'm going to finish on that picture. I will stop sharing and take any questions. We've actually come up to time, but I hope some of you do have some questions.
Yes, there's just been a couple of questions coming through in the chat box. There's one of our participants, and she is just a little bit nervous because she's a complete beginner. So she just wanted to know, is there a particular technique that you recommend for a beginner to start with, and a particular material or anything that they should be working with initially just to get their confidence going?
Well, I probably would say an A4 pad is the first thing, and probably not starting with watercolor. because the first attempts at watercolor can look very rubbishy. So probably pen or pencil. The advantage of pen is that it gives a very firm line. And if you're working at a fairly small scale like A4, hopefully you'll get fairly close to the line you want. But pencil might be preferable. You can rub something out with pencil if you don't like it, but expect it to be slightly smudgy unless you're careful. So I would say using line and pen or pencil on paper, and then you can add the other things in later. It's a matter of preference.
And she also wanted to know if there's any particular art shops you can recommend where she might be able to grab a couple of things.
It depends where you are. But most towns and cities have art shops. There's one around the corner from me here, Windsor Photo Prints, which is more for architecture or technical things, but has the usual sketch pads as well. Bradbury Graphics downtown is another one I would use quite regularly. It's only quite a small shop now compared to what it used to be, but it does carry a lot of material. And different towns and cities will have different art shops. They'll all have slightly different things. And sometimes if you're traveling, you'll find something you really like, which you've never seen in your art shop at home. So it's always worth dropping into an art shop and you'll find something you haven't seen before.
And then there's another very specific question just about, is there a specific brand of ink pen you recommend to use with watercolor, or would any ink pen work well in your experience?
Well, the main thing with a lot of inks is that the color will run when you put watercolor onto it, if you put the watercolor on after the pen. So if you want to put the pen line on and add your watercolor, it needs to be a waterproof ink. Now, the old rotring pens that I mentioned, you probably can't see it very well. These are the ones I used to use. You put in Indian ink into a cartridge. It's empty, but you fill the ink in that, and that Indian ink is waterproof up to a point. But if it's fairly fresh line, it will still run if you put watercolor onto it. I was actually in Australia when I picked up for the first time these little black pens. These are called Unipin Fine Line. They come in a whole range of sizes. In fact, I sent away for a packet of them, and I'm working my way through them. So those go from 0.05, which is a very thin line, up to 0.8, which is quite a thick line. So that you could get a variety of lines according to size you like to work at. If you're very refined, you could use the very fine one, but you expect it to look scratchy. Use a thicker line to get more freedom. But these are very good and they're waterproof. So you can almost immediately put watercolor on top if you need to. The only downside of that, as I said, is once you put watercolor over your black line, it's no longer black. It goes dark gray.
So another wee question, someone's just wondering if you'd ever come across the work of Malachy Coney, a local cartoonist. No?
I haven't actually, no.
No, maybe it's someone you can check out after the session.
Yes,
Wee recommendation from someone.
Coney, right? Make a note of that. So he does buildings as well, does he? I presume.
I'm not sure. I don't know his work. That was a suggestion from Harry. If Harry wants to elaborate, he's welcome to in the chat box.
Right. You got a picture there?
I just happen to have one of his cartoons sitting around me here. And when you were talking about, some of the great examples in the cartoonists, and I hadn't thought of it. And then I realized, very often the cartoonists really do have a good eye for architecture. I'm not very good at sharing stuff, so I'm going to hold this in front of the screen. I don't know if it'll show up or not. Very good. Okay.
Give it a try.
I don't know if you can.
Yes, just see bits of it there. Yes.
And that's actually it must be the Elephant Bar, which was in North Street in Belfast. Always wondered whatever happened to that elephant, but one of the great mysteries of our time.
And what's happened to the building now? It's gone as well.
Anyway, I just mentioned it because his work's quite architectural. I mean, he works in Ann Street in Forbidden Planet. I don't think he sells anything. I'm not promoting him as I'm not fighting for business. He's just a nice fellow. That's all. I came across his work. So thanks.
Well, thank you.
Thank you.
Actually, cartoons, because they exaggerate things, they have to hit things in a few lines. And in fact, the whole art of a cartoon is doing it with as few lines as possible and still getting across the character of the people or whatever he's drawing. So cartooning is actually very interesting to look at.
So I think there's still just a couple of questions popping up. So Dorothy was just wondering what exactly a screen print is. If you could just explain that briefly for Dorothy.
Right. Well, initially it started with Chinese, I think, invented it initially, and it was a silk screen, a rectangle with silk stretched across it. And that was the sort of key to it. Those are now usually nylon, and they come in different sizes of mesh. But that screen, which is stretched across, and it could be, you know, this sort of size, onto that you put your image. The very simplest way is cutting out a stencil in brown paper and putting that on, and you squeeze ink through it. So where the stencil is, the ink doesn't come through. Where you've pushed ink through it, through the mesh, it comes through. So that's brown paper is the very simple one. Most of the ones that people do now are photographic. I would do a separation on transparent paper. I would take a minute just to find one, but basically they'd be full size. Every color is a separate separation. Starting usually from a line drawing, which might be the final color, and then each color that I add on will be a separate drawing of the bit of red, the bit of green, whatever it needs to be. And you lay all the colors on one by another, one after another, starting from the lightest and ending with that black line. So it's a reverse registration from what you're actually drawing. And with that, then each time you make a print, you get exactly the same image with luck. And you have to register those colors to make sure they're not out of sync. But you're doing all your reds, then all your greens, all your blacks, and you end up with whatever size of edition you start with. You can't add another edition to it. Once you've made your 6 prints or whatever it is, that's it. So it's a laborious process. It takes a lot longer than just doing a picture, but it can do different things. You can get wonderful flat colors, you can get wonderful blended colors, and you have the chance of setting out what you're going to do more carefully than you would certainly standing in the street. So I do a lot of screen printing, and I like the effect, and I don't do it just to make prints. I do it because it's a way of producing an image.
Thank you. So Lindsay's just wondering if there's any buildings in particular that you really love to return to draw, and you've gone back to draw them multiple times over the years.
Yeah, there have been some which I would draw several times, but I usually try and find different things. And as I say, thinking of it as a diary, it's often when you're traveling, that's the time when you really should get your sketch pad out, because you're able to look at something with fresh eyes. But it's also a good thing to look at things which are familiar, and quite a good discipline just to take something around the corner, or like I showed you that foggy view of the buildings outside our window. It's a view I know very well, that I have drawn several times in different kinds of weather and different seasons as the trees come and go. Architecturally, it's not very interesting. It just happens to be convenient. And it's actually a good discipline, just thinking of whatever is around about you, can you make a picture of it? And you should be able to make a picture of almost anything.
Yeah, no, I was thinking that actually earlier, when I was thinking if people have any free time, even just kind of stepping out into their street and even starting to look at their house and looking at something that you might look at every day and then not really see anymore, and just see all the little details and see all the bits that kind of make it your home as well. That could be quite even an interesting challenge to get started with. Yeah. So someone else is just asking if they're allowed to use collage on their finished piece, which is, there are no rules particularly. So it's always good to see different techniques coming through. And then another couple of questions. So this is more just about specifics of the submission. So the first question is, should our final piece preferably include one of the heritage buildings of Northern Ireland? So that is something that we have asked for in the submission requirements. I popped a wee link in just at the start, which is our website, ulsterarchitecturalheritage.org.uk/Heritage Arts Challenge. You can see all the submission requirements there. So what we're asking is that it needs to be a real building or place in Northern Ireland, and it needs to be historic, so it needs to be over 30 years old. Now, it doesn't mean it has to be a listed building or anything. It doesn't have to be, on any particular register or anything like that. It's just a historic building that's over 30 years old, and it's completely anywhere of your choice, just in Northern Ireland. And then this is for you, Marcus. When you refer to candle wax, do you just use a normal, plain, long, colourless candle?
Not a long one. I should sharpen this from time to time to get a finer line, but that's, it developed its own point through time. It's just like a crayon, just happens to be clear, so you don't see, when you put it on paper, you can't see it. It's only when you put colour there that it comes out.
Yeah. So finally, just got one last question, which is probably quite a hard one, actually. It's just, what's your favourite building in Belfast?
Oh, as you go. No, as soon as I say one, I'll think of another one. No, I don't really have a favourite. I like Belfast. I like lots of other places as well. But what I like is to see something that's characteristic. So something like the Opera House is a very characteristic Belfast building, and is one of my favourites. It's not a building you would find, I think, anywhere else. Not designed by a local architect, as it happens, but it is a Belfast building using Belfast brick, and something added to that which makes it something unique. But no, I think what you're looking for is something which is characteristic, and it becomes interesting because of that.
Yeah, well, thank you so much, Marcus. That's all the questions we've got from everyone. I really hope that today has kind of inspired you to think about drawing things a little bit differently. Like Marcus says, it's not about necessarily drawing exactly what's there. It's about interpreting it through your own vision, your own eyes, and then telling your own story of the building. So hopefully it's also inspired you as well to think about different techniques. It's not just pencil on paper. You can branch out and use all sorts of different things. You can use different techniques to record buildings, in terms of, like Marcus said earlier as well, tones. You don't have to use line. You can use color. You can use collage, like someone wants to do. Work away. It's completely up to you. Hopefully it has inspired you just to think a little bit differently, and to get involved and get out there and get looking at buildings. So thank you again, Marcus. And like I say, check out our website just to see any of the submission requirements for the competition, and also to see all the other workshops that are coming up. So you might want to combine a few different things. You never know. You might want to use drawing and photographs together. You might want to create something different. So check those out as well. Our next workshop is on this Thursday at 7 o'clock, and that's with Padraig Regan, and they'll be doing a poetry workshop, and it'll be very interactive, and it sounds like a lot of fun. So if you can join us, please do. So thank you all again, and that'll bring us to the end of the session today. We will send the recording out to all the participants as well, so you can catch up if you missed anything at the start, or if you just want to go over a few different things again. So thank you. I'll let you go. Thank you, Marcus. Bye. Bye.